I did. You know me, I like to read.
Okay. Excuse me. Okey-doke. Wiradjuri, Yuandu Anita Heiss, Baladu Wiradjuri Gilang, Arambiji Boo, Brungley Boo, Megandi Bala Williams, Indimara Du, Wiradjuri Gu, Bunurong Gu, Kulin Gu. Hello, my name is Anita Heiss. I'm a Wiradjuri woman from Cowra and Brungle. My mob are the Williams, and I pay my respects to the Wiradjuri and the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. And I acknowledge the elders who are here with us this evening, in person but also in spirit. And I thank you all for joining us on a very cold winter's night. When you come from Brisbane, 9 degrees is very cold. I'd also like to acknowledge Linda and Mark, who are signing for us this evening. So Mandangu, which is Wiradjuri, thank you, and to Bill from Paperbark, or Paperback, I should say, our bookseller. So thank you, Bill, for coming as well. So tonight we're going to be hearing from 3 of our 52 contributors in the Growing Up Aboriginal anthology, Growing Up Aboriginal in Australia anthology, of which I've realised I have left in the green room. So if anybody would like to hand me a book, that would be great. Oh. Thank you. We're going to be hearing from our 3 contributors, and I just wanted to share a little bit about the process of putting this together. I don't call this really a book or an anthology. I believe this is a literary gift to the cultural landscape of Australia. Now, for me, the process of putting together this cultural gift began back in December of 2016 at a time where I had made a decision for myself that I would not take on any more projects because I was incredibly tired. And I got an email just before Christmas from Aviva Tuffield, publisher at the time at Black Ink Press, asking me if I was interested in being part of this project. Now, I looked at it and I thought there is no way that I could say no, because I didn't look at this as a project. I saw this as something that was an opportunity to give many, many Aboriginal people a voice in a landscape where we have remained voiceless for a very long time. I saw it as a chance for Aboriginal people to tell the raw truth about what it means to grow up in Australia as a First Nations person, often treated like a second-class citizen. I saw it as a platform, a much-needed platform, that showcased our pride in identity, our resilience as Aboriginal people. And it's a resilience, when you read this book, it's a resilience that you will find is forced upon us, and something we have to create in the earliest years of our childhood. And I also saw this as an opportunity to highlight the incredible talent we have in storytelling, a life skill that has been passed on to Aboriginal people from generation to generation to generation. I'd like to personally congratulate all those who were courageous and generous enough to submit to the anthology, and to thank them for trusting myself and Black Ink to edit and publish their work. Now, the reality is, for readers in the room, and for those of you who are interested in, for writers in the room, those who are interested in writing, but also just in the process generally, when you put something in the public domain, you have zero control of where it goes, of who reads it and how they read it, and how they will respond and react to it. Now, I'm really pleased to say that so far the responses have been amazing, from all walks of life. I've had tweets from people sitting on trains in Japan reading this work. Now, in less than 2 weeks of the book's release, it became a bestseller in stores in Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland, and it's already in reprint. And what that tells me is that Australia, and I am a glass half full person, and I want to believe good things all the time. I know there's lots of bad things, but what gets me out of bed every day is my belief in hope and goodness. But it tells me that Australia is finally ready to read authentic accounts of who we are, how we grew up, how we grow up, and how we live. And they're hearing these stories in our own voices. I know many are challenged by what they're reading because I'm getting lengthy emails from complete strangers. If you're in the room and you've sent me one, I haven't responded, I'm sorry, but I haven't had time. I'm being tweeted by people. Many are teacher librarians. Some of them I know who are here this evening, who are saying that they are challenged by what they're reading. They're reading a few stories, they're having emotional reactions, they're putting the book down, but they're picking it up again. And it just means that they are hearing for the first time stories that are sometimes heart-wrenching and mind-blowing, stories that are completely new to them. Now, we had over 120 submissions and we could only publish 52 due to page constraints. Now, the youngest author in growing up Aboriginal in Australia is 13 years old and lives in Sydney. And her story gives me an enormous amount of hope about what we have happening in our future. The oldest is in their 70s. One is incarcerated. More than 50% of the contributors are female. None of that was planned. It's just the way it turned out. Contributors come from nations across the country, from Nukunu to Noongar, Wiradjuri to Western Arrernte, Ku Yalinji to Kunibidji, Gunditjamara to Gumbaynggirr, and many places in between. Their experiences in this book cover coast and desert regions, cities and remote communities, and all of them, I promise you, will speak to your heart. Sometimes they will ask and call for your empathy, and oftentimes they will challenge the stereotypes that are created about us from outside our community, from our other. But always these stories and the contributors will demand your respect. And I believe that's because we deserve it. The hardest thing for me as editor was not being able to publish every single story. It was like being a ref at a football match. Someone is going to be unhappy with you. But where there is a will, there is a way, as they say. And so at the very early stages of the project, Aviva and I met with Kerry Kilner from Auslit, which is the online database of everything that's published in Australia. And we worked out a way in which all those people who unfortunately could not be part of this anthology could be published online on Black Words, and Black Words is a research community which has over 5,000 published Aboriginal writers and storytellers. So some of those stories already appear online in the Black Words subset of Auslit, and it's titled Growing Up Indigenous in Australia. So you have contributors who are in this printed version of Growing Up Aboriginal in Australia. You have a digital book titled Growing Up Indigenous in Australia. And tonight in the flesh, you have 3 authors talking about their stories on growing up Aboriginal in Australia. Now, you would have read their bios online, or perhaps you've read the book. So I thought, in terms of introducing them this evening, I would go to their social media handles and see how they define themselves. So Celeste, on her Twitter page, maybe I should have warned you people of this, but it's great. It says, I know there's like, half the room's probably full of Celeste fans. So it says, where black feminist ranters tweet. Arrernte, NTU ATSI organiser, freelance commentator, writer, accidentally anarchic. And then I went to your Facebook page because we're Facebook friends, and there was one line saying, I think, busy trying not to burn things down, or something like that. Next to Celeste, we have Zach, Penrith-Puchalski, and from his Twitter bio, Yorta Yorta, Jaja Warung, queer, too lost to lose. Really interesting self-definition there. Thanks, Zach. Now, Sharon Payne, we were in Canberra last week and I went looking for her on Twitter and Facebook and I didn't find her, but I found her on LinkedIn. But she didn't realise she was on LinkedIn. So I may or may not have the right bio for you, but I just picked the first 3 lines. Background in public policy, leadership and academic pursuits, including a law degree, a degree in psychology and anthropology, with psychology and anthropology majors, and has completed a postgraduate diploma in neuroscience. Are we happy with that bio? Do you want to be that person?
Well, I'll have to find an 8-year-old to probably authenticate it, but
Okay.
that's all I could fit in.
It's perfect, thank you. So we will have time for questions tonight. There'll be some roving mics later in the evening. But I wanted to open this evening with a general question to the panel. We did have 120 submissions, as I mentioned, 52 in the book. We did invite a handful of high-profile people that had already written in the public domain, either journalism or had books published. So we invited people like Miranda Tapsell and Deborah Cheetham, Adam Goods, Tony Birch, obviously, and Celeste. Celeste Liddle, you may know her blog, which is titled Rantings of a Black Feminist.
Rantings of an Aboriginal Feminist, yeah.
There you go, right. If you haven't looked at it, go check it out. So Celeste, you got an email saying, would you like to contribute? Did you automatically say yes, or did you have to think about it?
No, I automatically said yes. I think it was towards the end of the process when I got that email, but it was, I received it and I thought, okay, I'm going overseas. I just remember the context of how I threw it together. I'm going overseas in a week and a half. I just needed to sit down and do it. So I was saying before we came on stage that it seemed that I just sort of sat there and pumped it out and then submitted it in the way I was. And that was how it worked, mainly because it was close to the deadline, and there was also me wanting to take off on holidays. So when I did read up on what was happening, because for some bizarre reason I'd missed, I guess, the call out and all of that sort of stuff, mainly because, between full-time work and writing on the side and all that, I do get a little bit lost in what goes on. But when I read it, I just sort of thought, okay, I can contribute something to this, and I can contribute it pretty quickly, because a lot of the memories that I used in that are ones that have framed my life and are quite, vivid and raw and can be thrown together in a way that I hoped would connect. So that's how I did it, pretty much sitting down one afternoon, couple of hours, pumped it out and hoped for the best.
I hate these writers that say they pump things out in a couple of hours. I have like 29 drafts. It's interesting, and I think it's really important, and I'm really pleased that you contributed, because it's important to know that also that there were other people who were invited to contribute who chose not to. So we can't just assume that everybody wants to be part of a particular anthology, or everybody feels comfortable telling their story, because when you read Growing Up Aboriginal in Australia, you will see that they are very, very personal stories, which is why I think people were very brave and courageous to share, because particularly in a black context, you don't know how people will respond to that. Now, Zach, I think you may have been tagged into a post on Facebook or Twitter. How did you come to make your submission?
I got tagged a couple of times by a few different people on the call for submissions, and I thought, I'll get to that, and then I forgot about it for a little while.
Did you struggle pulling your story together?
I kind of just sat at the computer and I thought, I didn't even know what I was going to write, and then when I thought I could bang it out in like a day or two, and then that was wrong, and then I kept going back and editing it, changing it, fixing it, and then I sent it in, and I completely sent it in without a title or anything, and only when I got the email back, they were like, are you going to title this? And then I was just like, just call it Abo Knows. Just call it that.
Thank you. And Sharon?
Well, I saw it on Facebook, and I'd been urged for many years to write my story, and this was sort of percolating around, and so I just sat down about an hour and a half, I think, and belted it out and then sent it in on that afternoon. But then, I have written a few things, mainly legal text though, I must say.
Thank you. So each of them, I've got a set of questions of things that are interested to me, so I'm hoping they're interesting to you in terms of questions. Now, Celeste, you're 5 years old. Your story resonated with me because I had my first experience of racism when I was 5 as well. So you're 5 years old, you're living in Canberra, and you hear the words black bum, and they mark the first time you realise that you're different. And you say that to this day, those two words remain burned in your memory. Can you tell us about that moment and the impact it had on what you had always thought about your world previously and the world generally?
Well, it's really funny that I remember those two words because I barely remember the little girl who said them to me. I don't really remember the context they happened in, except that it was in front of our classroom and we were standing on the asphalt area in front of that. So when I did push her back, she would have landed pretty hard. I remember pushing her back, and I don't actually remember beyond that, but it was so sort of, it's this really stark memory of this little girl just sort of turning around to me and just going, "You black bum," and I just pushed her back and reacted because, it was that I felt humiliated. I remember the feelings of it. So I felt humiliated, I felt mocked, I felt all of this stuff, and my 5-year-old self didn't quite know how to handle that in any way other than to respond in what was quite quite an aggressive way that then was remembered by my teachers. So I don't even remember if I was disciplined at that point, but I do remember that my teachers held on to that, and that moment was reflected in my reports, which said how advanced I was at reading, and I'd done well at maths and everything was coming along well, but that I needed to learn how to control my temper. So the onus on me to reel in my reaction to racism was placed really, really early, and it was kind of, rather than we need to create an environment where this 5-year-old Aboriginal girl feels safe and her co-students aren't taunting her in these sorts of ways, she needs to learn to control her temper and not react to them. So that's always been framed in my head. But it was the reason why I guess I realised that was the moment was because before then I didn't actually think anything different or weird about my upbringing. I had an Aboriginal father and a white mother, and we were surrounded by all these Aboriginal people who were my mum and dad's friends, and they had a variation of partners. We'd go over to Uncle Charlie's house and we'd be surrounded by that environment again. I assumed everyone was, that this makeup was perfectly normal, that people were immersed in politics, that we'd hear people playing country songs on guitars. I assumed all of that was normal until I was told that it wasn't. And that was why that always stood out, and why it was that from that moment I think it was always about, me being told to reel in rather than people changing and people growing and not being racist from such a young age. Like 5 years old is a pretty young age to have those formed prejudices, but that little girl did.
And of course, no child is born racist. They learn that at home and then they take it to the playground. And you reminded me that I should let you all know that growing up Aboriginal in Australia was actually pulled together for an educational purpose, so for years 9 to 12. And one of my hopes with this book is, I hadn't thought about 5-year-olds shoving other 5-year-olds, but it was about providing an avenue for particularly teenagers to be able to respond to racism by using their words and finding strength in some of these stories, rather than particularly our young fellas potentially using their fists. So, that's one of my goals. Now, you spent your young child and youth growing up in Canberra and Melbourne. You say it was very white, and you use the word challenging a couple of times in your story. So can you tell us about that?
Well, I reckon when we lived in Canberra, all the black fellas lived in the south side of the city and we're in the north. So most of the gatherings that we had with family and broader community were when we'd all come together at one of their houses, or we'd go to a protest or something like that. And my schooling itself was, I think that, through primary schooling as well, I mentioned in high school I was in my chapter that I was the only identifying Aboriginal student throughout the entire schooling, even though I've since found out that I wasn't the only Aboriginal kid in that school. I was the only one who was identifying, which is an important thing. So there are other Aboriginal kids in that school who weren't identifying for whatever reason, whether they weren't comfortable in their own identity or whether they were scared of prejudice or whatever else. But I didn't necessarily have that choice. I kind of stuck out. But primary school wasn't much different. It was sort of, there were little bits and pieces that went throughout that primary schooling in Canberra where I'd be hit with a racial slur or something that people had heard, and I'd respond to that, and then I'd get in trouble. It was this really sort of isolating experience. I grew up in 2 incredibly white mainstreamy areas. Melbourne, it was the southeastern beachside suburbs. So really sort of white, mostly working classy sort of areas at the time, but really in a lot of ways monocultural, and the allowance for people of diverse experiences. Towards the end of it, I almost felt like I had a bit of Stockholm syndrome going on, and as an adult I needed to start unpacking that in order to get, you know, re-comfortable with my background and my identity and become an advocate of some sort of description.
Well, moving on to your advocacy and perhaps your rebellious nature, you write, "My culture was more social and political than it was traditional. It was also partly an outcast culture. The culture developed because you are always different, and society will remind you of this phenomenon. You either assimilate and you don't make waves, or you rebel. I chose the latter on nearly every front possible." So can you tell us about this need for you to rebel and the ways in which that rebellion played out in your youth? And do you see yourself as that rebellious person today?
Maybe. I guess, I mean, you know, I've never done really well at being told what to do. Never. When you know, when being told that this is what I should do, and my parents have told me this from a young age, but if they wanted me to do something, they'd often tell me to do the opposite because for some reason I had this need to challenge and to push against, and a lot of the time being given something to push against was how they could guarantee that I'd actually, you know, succeed. It was kind of maybe it was due to the backgrounds or that sort of early struggle or whatever else, but I like to put it more down to an inquiring mind. So if I was being told that something was how it was, I needed to unpack that. But even a lot of my chapter does talk about the link between, at the same time that I was I was experiencing racism, I was experiencing sexism as a girl child as well. And there were certain ways that I rebelled against that, whether it was cutting off my hair or dropping out of ballet classes or refusing to dress up in certain ways because the pressure's put on little girls to look pretty and petite, and all of that just didn't fit what I wanted to do. It was the same with all the stereotypes about Aboriginality that had hit me. So, you know, I'd constantly be pushing against those. You know, they'd assume that I would be all sorts of offensive stuff, like that I, you know, would be a slow learner, and that there was this whole sort of idea that Aboriginal people don't have the capacity to do well in education. And so I started topping classes. I started, you know, speaking out when we had issues. I started taking stances in various ways. I was really annoying when we did issues, like political issues in English classes in about year 10 or 11, because I'd get up there and argue with everyone. So there was a certain point in my schooling where I had enough, and I realised that assimilating in was never going to work. I was always going to be different, and I was never going to be true to who I was. And so I ended up going the exact opposite way, and it's been what's ended up making me from the rest, because my difference has actually been what has fed my career, what has fed everything else that I do, and the need to take a stand and to push back against injustice is very much at my core.
And I'm thinking that people in the audience had a bit of a chuckle, follow you on Twitter or have read your journalism or your blog, and I don't know you very well, we've met a couple of times, but I don't see you in pink or a tutu, so I can see you rebelling against that ballet. I've got more questions for you, but I'll come back and we'll move over to Zach. Now, Zach, your mother was Indigenous, your grandfather was Burnham.
Yep.
It's very special, yes. And your father was Polish.
Yep.
Tell us a little bit about your parents and the dynamics in your home.
In my family, because we had the half Polish, half Aboriginal side, it was a pretty good mix, and but people would always look at me or my sister with my dad, because he was like white, like blue eyes, blonde hair, kind of white, and people would probably think that we were kidnapped.
Well, there's other stories in the anthology that talk about that as
Amy
well.
Maguire, I think she told
Yes.
this, like a similar story. But
Yeah.
yeah, and my mum, she used to joke that if we went missing in Kmart or something like that, like good luck, because they won't think you're mine, because she was the very dark half of the family. But Mum spoke Koori words in my house, and Dad spoke some Polish words, so it was a bit of like a weird, but with English as the base. And so it was a bit of a like our own language at our own house. And it only occurred to me like maybe even like 5 or 6 years ago that this wasn't normal, because my friend was sitting there and my mum said she's going to go Jillawa. And it sounds like a nice place to go and stuff like that. Yeah, but it actually means
It's a resort,
toilet.
actually. Yeah.
Yeah, it means toilet. And my friends had like listened to me say this, my sister say this, and nobody ever asked us what that meant. They didn't know where we were going. Just to the bathroom. But yeah, we had a really good raising in Hampton, and we still live there. My sister, she had 2 babies, we used to joke, because she's black as well. We used to joke, like, imagine if you had, like, and her partner, by the way, this is important, her partner has red hair, and we used to joke, imagine if you had a black ranger. And then we joked about it too much, because that's exactly what happened. But yeah, it was really good, like, stable, solid family for that.
Now, your story is called, as we know, Abo Knows. Tell us about the first time you heard the word Abo.
I was in grade 1 or 2, and a boy named Sean, he told an Abo joke. I can remember what it was, but I'm not going to repeat it. And I'd never heard the word before, and he said it. And my Italian teacher, we were in Italian class, she heard it, and then she scolded him and like pretty much went to town on him. Like, this poor boy, like, he was taught this joke by somebody, and I'd never heard the word before, so I just laughed at this joke about my own race just to fit in. And then I went home and I told my grandma and my mum. I asked them what the word meant, and then they were like, who's saying that to you? Like, what's going on there? Who told you that? And then they explained that to me, that I was Aboriginal and that meant I was different. And I initially refused to believe them. And then as I got older, whether I wanted to believe them or not, people also like grew more racist as they went on, and through high school, that's when it really started with the racism stuff, because me and my sister were 2 of the only black people until I found out Celeste's sister went to my high school. So
It's interesting, though, because you talk about, you say it's rough to be Aboriginal and proud and stick up for yourself when it means having no friends at all.
Yeah.
All white people in my school would laugh at every Abo joke ever heard while being simultaneously nice to me. So let's talk about racism dressed up as humour and how that impacted on you, particularly through your youth.
There was another Aboriginal boy, his name was Reese, and he used to make the Abo jokes with the white people, and that was something that you could either be one of 2 ways. You could be like defiant and like, you can't say this to me, or you just join them. Like, there was really those lines. Yeah, and being like, getting the Abo Knows comment, I got it when I was about 15. And then it was also something, once I wrote the story, that I found out my sister had had the same comment. And then I used to actually want to get like something done about my nose, but now I kind of like it. But, yeah.
We all grow into it.
Yeah.
I just wondered, there's a link between what Celeste mentioned about low expectations of achievement in the educational system for Aboriginal people. you're at uni now, you're often the only black fella in a large auditorium or a seminar, and you've told me that quite often people just assume you've got some direct entry,
Yeah.
that they don't, the original assumption is that you're smart and you got into uni.
Like I might be like accidentally there or something
Yeah,
like that.
this-
It happened throughout my entire education. In primary school, me and my sister were put in a special reading group because they thought we couldn't read. But it just turned out that we were shy and didn't like reading out loud. But they put us in a special reading group for ages, and they did little plays and stuff to build comfort. It was really weird. Also, when I was in like grade 3, they made us do this. Every concert they have every year for the whole school, they made us do one on like the invasion, and me and my sister were like singing this song about Botany Bay while we're being peasants on the ship. And then my mum's sitting in the
probably
audience.
still happens in some places, unfortunately.
And then my mum was sitting in the audience, probably watching, like, what? What's going on there? But yeah.
Now, you submitted your story on time 12 months ago.
Yeah.
But things have changed in your life from submitting and publication. The time, and you wrote your story, you wrote that you never wore the Aboriginal flag T-shirt that you owned out in public, but you told me this week, and you're wearing it tonight, you wear it all the time now. Why
Yep.
didn't you wear it before, and what changed that?
Probably because I go to uni at RMIT just around the corner, and being on the train, it was probably a fear, but also a realistic fear, because people always come up around Invasion Day, like Australia Day, accosting or like asking you questions like you're the only Aboriginal person on the earth, and you answer for every single one of them. And so everybody always has a comment about it. So some people are overly nice about seeing an Aboriginal person, which is just as annoying as when they're overly like glaring at you and stuff. So I just thought it would bring like attention in a way that would get me into trouble, like even like physically.
You have to be
attacked.
prepared and mentally capable and want to have the confrontation. And just as an aside, I flew into Wagga on January 26th this year and had on one of Vernon Arkey's shirts that said, Australia, drive it like you stole it. And what was funny was I'm walking through Brisbane Airport and literally people were looking at my T-shirt and stepping out of my way. Like, it's like, excuse me, I'm going to the Qantas Club. It's a T-shirt, it can't hurt you. But I'm in a shuttle bus from the airport. Why I didn't get an Uber, I don't know. I'm in the shuttle bus. And there's a policeman in the shuttle bus with me, and he's going because the Common Games torch is coming to Wagga, and so they're organising, the police will be there and so forth. There's a woman from the Gold Coast sitting behind me and a local woman from Wagga, and so he says, we're just chatting, people are just chatting, and he says, I've just come from Sydney and there was, an Aboriginal protest march going on. And the woman behind me says, could you shoot them? It is the closest I've ever come to almost, and I'm very conscious of my public profile and being a role model and all that blah, blah, blah. I nearly jumped over the seat and punched her in the face. But I turned around and I said, are you for real? And then she says, it's not like you would. In front of the policeman, right? And I'm sitting there, and I did not know what to do. I just wanted to get out of this. I think I put on Facebook or tweeted in a car in Wagga, and this has just happened. But the policeman, to his credit, was really good. He said, well, it was a peaceful march. People have the right to protest. And then, of course, they backpedaled. But so that way of thinking, and he's still alive and healthy in rural Australia, and also in public. People are not embarrassed to say things like that. And this is 2018, so it was just reminding me of that.
I've got a Vernon Arkey T-shirt story too, but I'll leave it this one.
Okay, well, has anyone else got one? We'll come back to that. So I just want to move on to Sharon now, and I have so many questions, but I'm conscious of time, and I know people will want to ask questions. Now, Sharon, you open your story with a question. And I really love this. It says, the question to Sharon is, when did you realise you were Aboriginal? Now, can you tell the audience, please, about the circumstances around being asked that question and your response to it?
Do you mean the N-word bit?
No,
no,
I will ask you about the N-word.
Yeah,
but-
oh, well, sorry, yeah. Well, people would say to me, oh, when did you realise you're Aboriginal? And I would say, you know, well, when did you realise you weren't? As though it was some epiphany that people got. And of course, you know, a lot of people got affronted by it. So I actually changed and realised that maybe they were genuine. And I would then say, well, look, I don't know. I really can't tell you the date or the time. It's just something that I was. And even talking to my auntie recently, we were saying, you know, there's never been a time we didn't know that Fraser Island was our country. And that's what I should say. I'm a Wannamata from Budgela of Gurri, we call Gurri, Fraser Island. We have our native title. And so I was born in Hervey Bay on country, but we moved up to North Queensland, west of Cairns, and this is the end of the 50s, by the way, just gave you my age away. As you can appreciate, it was very different to living in the city. There was no editing of anything that they talked about, and Abbo wasn't even a word back then, I think. But so, yeah, a lot of people did use other ways to describe who they thought was Aboriginal.
Let's talk about that then, the first time you heard the N-word.
Well, that was right. You know, I was, 7 years old, sitting in class, and this young girl got up and said, my father reckons your mother's just a nigger. And I thought, oh, really? No idea what she was talking about. I thought it was a last name. Like I said, I had no idea what they were talking about. So I went home and asked my mother, and my mother's pretty fiery at the best of times, and that really got up her goat. And then, of course, so she had a few things to say about this girl's father and how he was, he liked her a lot too. And so she, not in so many words. Anyway, so afterwards though, when we were down with my black family, Christmas time, she set me up with Grandma and she said, tell Nana what that girl said to you in school, Sharon. And I said, oh, she reckoned Mum's a nigger. Oh my God, my grandmother just propped. She was so angry, and of course I got into big trouble for using that word. But of course after that, Mum would say to me, whatever you do, don't tell people you're Aborigine. Well, I didn't really know what that had to do with nigger anyway. And then she said, and especially don't tell your little sister Rosalind because she cannot keep her gob shut. So, so that was, part of it all. But I can tell you, living up there in North Queensland, we kept our head down. We did not advertise it whatsoever. And since then, I've had people saying, oh, you were denying your Aboriginality. No, we just kept quiet about it. It was like wearing your T-shirt. If you didn't have to put your hand up, and that was it. My mother was protecting us, so we always knew, we certainly knew that Mum was different to other mothers, that's for sure. And so it was, it was just something that was part of us, and it was a great part of us though. It was like a happy secret, except we were worried that if they found out, they'd take us away. And I remember reading the diary of Anne Frank a few years later, and it occurred to me that it was kind of like a Nazi situation, that, this fear that we lived under, that we could be taken away, because often they would tell you when they took a child or they took someone away, they would say that they died, so you didn't go looking for them. And of course we were sure that they'd been killed. So, that kept us quiet for sure.
There's lots of very common connections and threads in the anthology. There's an enormous amount of commonality around identity, about non-Indigenous Australians' obsession with skin colour and defining Aboriginality from a very unknowledgeable perspective. And there's also lots of hope and warmth and humour. And there's a positive in many stories have lots of positives. I think it's important to say that. And in your story, Sharon, you were the first Aboriginal person at your university. So I'm wanting to know what university that is. But you talk about uni life being really good.
Oh, it was just wonderful because, you can appreciate, we didn't have a lot of books at home. My father had 2 years education, my white father, and my mother just a little bit more. And it was when I was in high school, I was actually kicked out of school because the headmaster reckoned I'd moved a chair. Didn't have to do much once they knew you were Aborigine. Anyway, so I just went and rang my father up, and he came up to school, and he was really upset. And what he found out was that I had one of the highest IQs, like the top 5% of IQs, or nearly 200 or something. And but I'd been told all the time, they wanted to keep it a secret because no one was allowed to find out. This was back in the days when they did those things. And so, it was a frustrating time for me, high school, in terms of that. But I was really, when I got to university, oh my goodness, it was like a whole new world. The books, the talks. I mean, I did anthropology and psychology, but I also did theosophy, classics, ancient history, modern history, everything, political science, everything I could garner just in order to get that education. And my son, who's sitting in the audience, it was his father who was my main person who really encouraged me all the time. He was just wonderful, and there was never, he was the one that was so outraged that I'd have to go every week and report and say, yes, I've been a good girl, yes, I've been going to school, I've been doing my assignments and all that, and nobody else in that year had to do that. So they were, he was pretty outraged, and they were sort of getting an idea of, what it meant to be Aboriginal and the extra burden that we were under in order to prove ourselves. But I just thought it was normal, I can tell you. I didn't worry me getting the bus into town.
And you've got your postgraduate diploma in neuroscience. What are you doing with that?
Well, it was amazing. I've looked at it. First of all, I did anthropology, the study of humans. It was called the study of men then. And so then it was, psychology, how humans react. And then law, how we resolve conflict or create conflict, as I've realised. And then, of course, the new advances in neuroscience were just so fascinating to me. And it kind of, brought it all together. And what the amazing thing I learned was, when you look at racism, racism is about putting people down. And whenever you put someone down, it's because you want them to be at their level. And so I've realised that, as I was saying the other night, a lot of the stuff I believe that I was witnessing is post-traumatic stress disorder. It is very much trauma and transgenerational trauma. And so when I had someone there saying, we want to acknowledge the trauma that Aboriginal people have faced, and I said, well, I'd like to acknowledge the trauma that you and your mob and your relations and your background have faced, because anybody who's a racist obviously has a very negative view of themselves. So I can say it's just been an epiphany, and I'm actually doing my PhD now in, it was in law and neuroscience, and it's called Aboriginal Until Proven Innocent. And it's actually, it looks at the biases that we all have, and the judiciary, if any judiciary prosecutors, police out there, you won't admit this, but everybody has those things, that baggage that we grow up with. And I guess my agenda is to get people to understand it, identify it, and then do things that can counteract that sort of extreme prejudice and stereotyping.
Thank you. We're going to open the floor for questions, and while the microphones are going around, I just wanted to ask Celeste something that's been raised. There's been a lot of media around this book, which is fantastic. People are genuinely interested in the stories that are being told, and one of your quotes has come up quite a number of times. At the end of your story, you say that until this country finally grows up Aboriginal, you won't be able to completely grow up Aboriginal yourself. Can you unpack that for us?
Yeah. Look, Australia is, in my opinion, quite a sick and immature kind of country. We haven't, I look at my little nephews and this... Sorry, my ears are still suffering, but yeah, I had to try and work out what that sound was, because I've just gotten off long-haul flights this week. But my little nephews and the sorts of stuff that they're learning is not that much more progressed from what I was learning 35 years ago. I'm 40 now, so yeah, 35. They're still trying to work out how to incorporate Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander content into education. We're still having to go out onto the streets every single year and having the same discussions in the lead up to Invasion Day. So having to, we're always being hit with why are you causing trouble? Why can't we all just come together? This is a day for all Australians. And, 60,000 people on the streets of Melbourne are saying, well, no, it's really not. But 12 months down the track, we're having the exact same discussions over and over again. The idea that that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people would want to assert their own identity, manage their own affairs, have rights to their own lands and cultures and all that, these are all things that have not been rectified. They're still very much, just sitting there, and Australia's, gone from an active terra nullius into a sort of social and cultural one, where the exact same idea that was land belonged to no one is still very much something that seems to permeate through society. So Australia itself needs to grow up Aboriginal. It needs to be able to deal with, really simple things like dual place names for landmarks. People are still, stubbornly calling Uluru Rock, 30 years beyond the handback of that. We shouldn't be arguing about these things, but there's a stubbornness of mainstream Australia to not deal with the history and therefore not deal with the contemporary, not deal with what's going on right now. And that'll continue to go on until Australia does actually start to deal with this and come to the table and commit to a future that doesn't erase what is several millennia worth of history and culture and knowledge and so on. So yeah, I worry that I will never be able to grow up Aboriginal within this country because I'm always going to be fighting. I'm worried that my nephews and niece are going to have those same struggles as a result of this same inability to deal with the past and become a whole, complete, accepting sort of landmass of people.
Thank you for that. Now, we will take some questions from the floor. Please make them questions and not statements. I don't generally like taking questions at events like this because I believe people need to reflect and think about what's been said, but our panel is very generous and they're happy to take your questions. So do we have some? Marriage proposals? Yeah. I've not got marriage proposals, but I have got proposals at events like this. Okay, there's a question?
Yes. Just following on from the previous speaker, sorry, I've just missed your name. Celeste. Do you think a treaty and recognition of Aboriginal people within our constitution could help towards this healing for Australians and for Australia to grow up?
I'm pretty hardcore about treaties and coming to the table and discussions and negotiations taking place first. So I'm not that interested in recognition in the Constitution because the Constitution, in my view, was written on the basis of terra nullius. So it was about imposing a different rule on the erasure of entire groups of people who had been here for millennia. So I think that that's a very important thing that needs to be done, clan-based treaties all across the country in order for these sorts of structures, self-determination, for education, for all of that to flow on and become part of how this nation, I guess, reconciles and recognises itself. And yeah, there hasn't been that process of sitting down at a table and coming to an agreement and dealing with the huge amount of cultural and historical and political and whatever else baggage that we have going on. So I think to me that's key.
Sharon or Zach, do you want to respond to that question?
Well, I'm certainly with you. As a lawyer, I think our constitution's a bit of a joke, actually. When I look at the French, liberty, equality, fraternity, and we've got by His Gracious Majesty and all this sort of things. And then, you talk about post offices and railways and stuff in there. It's kind of a bit of a strange thing. What we need is a new constitution, one that is really based on integrity and decency and all those sorts of things, rather than, it was a lot of self-interest, that set it up in the beginning. And I think, as one of the Yolngu mob said, it's a short job, that constitution. We could make it better and get rid of that preamble stuff for starters. So, so I mean, to me, it sort of legitimises it. I mean, I couldn't come into your house tonight and commit harry-carry and murder and rape and everything and say, oh, and by the way, I've written this bit of paper now that said it belongs to me. So to me, often that is where I see it, and I really don't think that we are at the point where we can really talk about treaty. And I'd love to know, because of the factions that we have now and the differences, I'm not sure who's going to be heading those clans to do it, because, it's going to be a different thing. So it really has to come from, I think, a level that's far more intelligent, far more mature than the current government that we have.
Yeah.
No? Okay, next question. While we're looking for the next question, we've got a question there.
G'day. So I just wanted to ask if you guys have any sort of favourite writers, necessarily the Aboriginal or not, or like Cleverman's really great on TV, and so is Grace beside me. So I'm wondering if you have any sort of favourite creative stuff that's by Aboriginal people that the rest of us can look in and enjoy.
By genre? So poetry, Ellen Van Neerven, Ali Cobby Eckermann, Lionel Fogarty, Samuel Wagon Watson. Fiction, Melissa Lukashenko, Kim Scott, Tony Birch. Non-fiction, like if you go to Black Words, there's 5,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander writers published in there. And I've got blogs. If you have a look at my blog, I've done whole lots of suggestions. I've done 3 Black Book Challenges. So you may have seen the BBC Book Challenge a few years ago, where how many of the 100 list of classics have you read? And I think I read about 6. And I thought, well, I'm going to do a list of 100 Aboriginal books to see how many Aboriginal authored titles that Australians had read, and then I did 3 of those. So I know some libraries have used those. So if you're looking for some suggestions, there's, you can have a look online. I could go on forever, but I'll let you guys talk.
I like Wiradjuri Nukunu, that's Kath Walker.
Yep.
When I was in high school, I first discovered her by my English lit teacher, because I used to do English lit. Son of Mine was one of her poems, and that's one that I hold pretty close to me. I just read a great book. Last time I read a book was probably at the start of this year, so I'm pretty slack with it. But there's a book called Grief is the Thing with Feathers, and it was a pretty big book, but that one, the whole tone of it was about this man and his grieving for his wife, but that really set, I just recently lost my father, a couple of years ago now, but reading that book, pretty much, that was the last thing I read, so there we go.
Just for those who didn't know, so Wiradjuri Nukunu was Kath Walker until 1988, and then changed her name as a protest to the bicentenary. Wiradjuri means paper bark in her language. It was Nukunu from Stradbroke Island, or Minjerribah, and she published the first collection of poetry in 1964 titled We Are Going, and so brilliant was it back in the day. I think it sold about 10,000 copies, which is a lot of books, particularly of poetry, in 1964, that reviewers didn't believe that an Aboriginal woman, or an Aboriginal person, let alone a woman, could have written that work. In that collection is the Charter of Aboriginal Rights, which I think is as valid today as it was back in the 1960s. And she first presented that, I believe, in 1972 at a Fakatsi meeting in Adelaide. And when she got home, her house had been trashed. And I just think it's really interesting the way, and she was an extraordinary activist, a storyteller, an artist, and a great legacy, and a pioneer in a year where the NAIDOC theme is because of her we can. For someone like me who's an author, she was one of our greatest pioneers, publishing it at a time where, there weren't citizenship rights and there was still, fighting for the referendum in 67. She was out there in force.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I must say I was always an admirer of Wiradjuri, and Kerry Reid Gilbert is another one I think of, but just for Wiradjuri, my favourite line of hers is, "One time naked, we never knew shame. Now we put clothes on to hide what's her name." So that's a taste of the sort of stuff that she would get out there and say.
Well, I'm just going to copy those two because I've talked about No More Boomerang in my chapter because that was one that I read out when I was 15 years old to a school assembly after I'd been asked to take part in a multicultural assembly. So finding that poem and reading it and seeing what she said, I think I stunned everyone in the audience when I read it out. But the words in it were harsh, it was humorous, it was what she contained within those, those verses was just extraordinary, and it really appealed to 15-year-old me trying to find my way through the system. Another one that I'll just throw in, so there's so many that I admire and love, but Lisa Belair was a huge influence on me, and I went to uni at La Trobe at the same time as her, so some of her works, very sort of urban Melbourne sort of poetry, highly political. You had this Aboriginal woman who was a lesbian feminist and a community photographer. And so, she was exhibited at, what's it called, Kuriti Heritage Trust last year, which was 10 years since she passed away at a really young age. But one of her poems, Women's Liberation, was one of the ones that I read. So it was, don't tell me about women's liberation, such and such. And she's taking apart, I'm trying to think, in the 90s, this incredibly sort of white Australian feminism and inserting some cultural dialogue into it. Ultimately stating that she believed completely in women's rights, but she couldn't believe in women's rights without the dismantling of racism, which was a huge inspiration for me.
And the collection, Lisa's collection, is called Dreaming in Urban Areas, and it's been out of print for so long. So if you ever, I did a great book swap for the ILF at UQ recently, and that book was in, somebody had put that book in, you can't get it. I saw it online for like $3,000. And so this student, it was a Murray student, goes, I'm going to have these books, how much do I owe? And I was like, where did you get that book from? And so I was really happy that you got it. So if you see it in a secondhand bookshop, grab hold of it, because it truly is an iconic piece of Australian literature. And you reminded me of Romaine Morton, who's also a fantastic performance poet. And she had a collection come out in about 2004 called Post Me to the Prime Minister. And I use her work particularly with young girls because she wrote a fantastic piece called Ode to Barbie. And about, you're sitting in the classroom, everyone wants to be like Barbie, and, she was sitting there with, curly black hair and so forth. There are so many. Okay, next question. There's a hand up. And we have 1 minute 45 on the Corey clock.
This weekend is, with the Australian Football League, is Aboriginal or Dreamtime game, and it's a highly publicised process. I was wondering if you could comment whether you think contributions like that are positive and have an effect that is beneficial to the Aboriginal people, or do you think that they cover over and confuse the issues?
Yeah. Victorians want it. So it's Indigenous round, so Doug Nicholls round of the AFL.
I just really quickly want to, well, apart from the fact that my little nephew's running out on that ground this weekend, so I'm a little bit proud of that. I only just found that out because I just got back from overseas, but I find it really, really hard to see the benefit in a lot of that sort of stuff if someone like Adam Goodes can be booed for an entire season and the powers that be can deny that that's racism. It's kind of like there's this really important event and so many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people get to go along to that game and we get culture celebrated, and then it'll just be thrown aside for the rest of the season, and actual racism going on a daily basis on the sporting ground will just be glossed over. For me, I love the fact that that exists. I love that there's a week to showcase, and it's a week that has so many key anniversaries for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people within it. But once that week's finished, it seems like all bets are off again, and that to me is terrifying.
Sorry, it's almost as though, well, we're not racist because we've done this.
Yeah.
And I mean, like I say, we love the thing from ourselves, but we really don't think that it's going to make a difference in the wider world. It does give us a spurt of pride.
I need to say I was at the long lunch yesterday put on by Michael Long's foundation, and you know, I'm not a footy chick by any means, but there is an enormous sense of community and respect and acknowledgement for what Michael Long has done in the code, which led to, you know, obviously his long walk into Canberra, which led to what has become Dreamtime at the G. And I think acknowledgement and respect for those who have created that space for Aboriginal people to, and largely non-Aboriginal people, because obviously there's more white fellas than us, to participate in something. And at the ground level, what I see quite often around the country is that there are a lot of people who want ways to demonstrate and participate. And if they can only do it at that time, and I absolutely agree. Obviously, I'm a friend of Adam's, and I was horrified with what happened to him. And I wrote a book with Adam called Kicking Goals with Goodsy and Magic, and I in a year where he was Australian of the Year, and he left the code in an appalling way, which can't be changed. And I'm pleased to say I feel my understanding of talking at him is that he's okay, which is a good thing. But I mean, glass half full, I do believe we need to provide structures, not just for white fellas, but for our own mob to come together and celebrate and acknowledge that the things that our people have done in the past, to put things on the political radar, even though they may not have shifted as much as they need to, and they still need to. I think we need to acknowledge that people have done a lot of good work, and there is a lot of good work still to do. And this light is flashing at me from down there. And I feel like saying that while ever we're on Aboriginal land, we'll talk for as long as we like. But I don't know, the Wheeler Centre's probably having to pay people by the minute here. Zach, did you want to say something?
I think any kind of representation is positive initially, but then you find out, like, beneath the surface that they're not really doing things to make effective change. I have, like, an example. It's like Jessica Malboy, when she was on the cover of maybe 3 different magazines at the same time. And you know, Melbourne Central, just across the street, how they have the newsstands. I was actually coming to uni, and I'm like in my 20s. And then I saw her on the cover of these magazines. And then I thought that and I'd never thought about representation before until in my 20s, like, I'm nearly tearing up seeing somebody that looks like me is on the cover of, like, these magazines, and they, like, Vogue and In Style and, like, massive magazines. So I can see the, like, surface, but also, like, as long as they're doing meaningful things beneath that, I'm okay with it.
Oh, they've put another 20 minutes on the clock, is that right?
19 hours. 19 hours. 20.
Are there any more questions? Okay, so like in the spirit of reconciliation, we will sign your books for free when you go to Paperback and buy your book from Bill, and they're going to set up a table here. But right now, I'd like to say Mandangul to our beautiful panel. Thank you to our beautiful spirits and guests who have been very generous with their words in the book, but also in person tonight. And I'd like to say Mandangul to you for joining us this evening. So thank you.
Yeah.
All right, you're happy to stay.
Different to the